look at your hands right now. Feel the pulse in your wrist. Your body is held together by skin, muscle, and bone, completely safe under normal atmospheric pressure. But 30,000 feet in the air, inside a metal tube screaming through the clouds, that safety is an illusion. When a plane falls from the sky, investigators look for the black box. They expect to hear mechanical failure. They expect to hear panic. But what happens when the black box records something that defies the laws of biology? What happens when the tape records the sound of human bone fusing into the aluminum walls? And a voice that isn't human calling out the investigator's name. Turn off your lights. Lock your doors. Because what you are about to hear is the official, classified audio transcript of Flight 884 and the harvest in the sky. Every time a commercial airplane crashes, investigators look for one specific object: the black box. It is a highly reinforced, bright orange flight data recorder built to withstand temperatures of thousands of degrees, deep ocean pressure, and catastrophic impacts. It holds the final, terrifying moments of a flight: the mechanical failures, the panic, the last words of a crew realizing they are about to die. But what if some black boxes record things that never should have existed? My name is Marcus, and for 12 years, I worked as a digital audio restoration specialist for the National Transportation Safety Board. My job was simple, yet deeply haunting. I would take the corrupted, water-damaged, or fire-scorched magnetic tapes from recovered flight recorders, run them through audio isolation software, and clean up the static. I had to listen to the final screams of hundreds of people, over and over, just to extract a few seconds of mechanical data. You think you get used to it. You think your mind grows a thick layer of calloused armor against the horror of human death. But you don't. The screams stay with you. They echo in your ears when you try to sleep at night. But nothing prepared me for Flight 884. In the winter of 2024, a transatlantic flight vanished off the radar completely over the North Atlantic. There was no distress signal, no sudden drop in altitude. 1 second the radar blip was there, and the next it was gone. 6 months later, a deep-sea research vessel pulled a heavily corroded orange cylinder from the abyssal plains, 4 miles beneath the ocean surface. It was the cockpit voice recorder. When it arrived at my lab, it was covered in deep-sea sludge and reeked of stagnant, ancient salt water. The metallic casing was deeply dented, but not from an explosion. The dents looked like teeth marks, massive, jagged ridges pressed deep into the reinforced steel. I hooked the internal memory drive to my system, isolated the digital noise, put on my headphones, and hit play. The audio started with standard cockpit ambience, the low, rhythmic hum of the jet engines, the soft click of switches. The pilot and co-pilot were discussing fuel levels and weather patterns. Everything was completely normal. Then, at exactly the 30-minute mark, the atmospheric pressure gauge in the cockpit began to beep. But it wasn't a warning for a decompression leak. It was a warning for an increase in pressure. That is physically impossible at 30,000 feet. The air outside an airplane is thin and freezing. But on the recording, you could hear the structural steel of the fuselage beginning to groan. A deep, agonizing creak of metal being squeezed from the outside. Then came the sound of the captain clearing his throat. His voice sounded heavy, thick, and wet. He whispered to the co-pilot, asking why the air suddenly tasted like copper. Within seconds, the audio feed became clogged with a sickening, wet, tearing sound. It sounded like someone dragging a heavy sponge across a rough concrete floor. I turned up the frequency filters, isolating the cockpit microphones. What I heard made my breath catch in my throat. The pilots weren't breathing oxygen anymore. The cockpit was rapidly filling with a thick, viscous liquid. You could hear it sloshing against the control panels. You could hear the captain gasping for air, but instead of inhaling oxygen, his throat filled with a wet, choking rattle. He was drowning. They were both drowning in the middle of the sky. And then the screaming started from the passenger cabin behind them. It wasn't a normal scream of terror. It was a chorus of absolute, visceral agony. Through the thin cockpit door, the microphones picked up the sound of human flesh tearing apart. It sounded like hundreds of wet leather jackets being violently ripped in half at the exact same time. The structural integrity of the passengers' bodies was failing. The immense, unnatural pressure was crushing them inside their own skin. I heard the distinct, sickening pop of human bones snapping under pressure. The sound of ribcage collapsing inward, puncturing lungs and hearts. The audio was a chaotic, bloody soup of gurgling throats, snapping joints, and the relentless, heavy sloshing of warm fluid filling the cabin. I wanted to rip the headphones off my ears. Every instinct in my body told me to smash the computer screen and run out of the building. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by a cold, primordial dread. The co-pilot was still alive somehow. On the recording, his fingers were desperately clicking switches, trying to deploy the oxygen masks. But the masks were useless. Through the microphone, I heard him open his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Only a thick, bubbling spray of blood hitting the glass of the windshield. Then, the cockpit door didn't just open, it melted. The audio captured a sound like flesh bubbling on a hot stove. A horrific, sizzling hiss. The metal door was being dissolved by something highly acidic, something organic. Through the ruined doorway, a new sound entered the cockpit. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the engines. It was a voice, but it didn't come from a human throat. It sounded like dozens of different human voices, men, women, and young children, all speaking the exact same words in perfect, robotic unison. The voices were layered over each other, completely out of sync, creating a discordant, vibrating frequency that made my teeth ache through the headphones. The voice said, "The meat is ready for the harvest. The sky belongs to the garden now." Immediately after those words, the audio recorded the sound of something massive slithering into the cockpit. It didn't have feet. It moved with a heavy, wet, sliding motion, dragging a massive weight behind it. I could hear the wet squelch of raw flesh scraping against the pilot's seats. The co-pilot began to scream a high-pitched, breathless shriek that suddenly ended with a sickening, wet crunch. It sounded exactly like someone stepping on a large, ripe watermelon. His skull had been crushed instantly. What happened next on the tape defies every law of physics, biology, and reality. The mechanical hum of the airplane engines didn't stop, but the pitch changed. The mechanical drone slowly transformed into a deep, vibrating heartbeat. A wet, fleshy thump-thump, thump-thump, shaking the entire structure of the aircraft. The metal of the plane was turning into living tissue. On the recording, the sound of the wind rushing outside the plane changed from a sharp whistle to a wet, wheezing breath. The airplane was no longer a machine made of aluminum and titanium. It had been converted into a flying, biological organism. A massive, winged leviathan made of compressed human bone, bleeding muscle, and screaming nerves, soaring through the dark clouds at 500 miles per hour. 1. I listened in absolute horror as the remaining survivors in the cabin began to scream again, but their voices were changing. They weren't screaming in terror anymore. Their voices were slowly merging into the structural heartbeat of the plane. One passenger, a woman whose microphone was closest to the rear galley, was weeping. She was sobbing, begging for her mother. But as she spoke, her voice started to distort, stretching out into a long, metallic groan. You could hear her jaw fracturing, her teeth shattering as her mouth was physically fused into the aluminum wall of the cabin. She was becoming part of the airplane's inner lining. Her skin was being stretched across the wires, her veins connecting directly to the fuel lines. The entire plane was a waking, breathing womb of agony. The final 2 minutes of the tape were the hardest to endure. The chaotic noise of screaming and tearing flesh slowly subsided, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound left was the deep, rhythmic thumping of the plane's collective heart, and the wet, squelching breathing of the entity sitting in the captain's seat. Then the entity leaned directly into the cockpit microphone. The audio became heavily distorted, overloaded with proximity bass. The overlapping voices of 100 dead passengers spoke through its mouth one last time. It didn't speak to the air traffic controllers. It didn't speak to the world. It spoke directly to me. It called out my name. "Marcus," the voice whispered, a wet, bloody hiss vibrating through my headphones. "We see you listening in your little dark room. We know the frequency of your ears. We are flying over your city tonight. Open your window and let the air inside. The tape ended with a sudden, deafening sound of a metallic screech, followed by absolute, dead static. I sat in my lab for 3 hours, staring at the flat line on my audio editing software. My skin was pale. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't even pick up my coffee cup. I deleted the file. I wiped the hard drives. I packed my bags, walked out of the NTSB office, and never went back. I told them I was having a nervous breakdown. They believed me. People in my line of work lose their minds all the time. But I know what I heard. 2. It has been 2 years since that day. I live in a basement apartment now, far away from the windows, deep underground, where the sky cannot see me. But every time a storm rolls in and the atmospheric pressure drops, I can feel my own skin tightening. I can hear a low, rhythmic thumping vibrating through the concrete walls. Next time you board a commercial flight and you look out the window at the endless, beautiful blue sky, don't look too closely into the clouds, because up there, where the air is thin and the cold is absolute, something is waiting. Something that is tired of eating cold metal and is looking for fresh meat.